Vicki Hogarth, and welcome to Southwest Magazine. My guest today is the MP for New Brunswick Southwest, John Williamson. Thanks for being here today, John.
It's my pleasure to be back again.
Every time you're here, I feel like it's only been a matter of weeks, but so much has happened.
Yes.
I want to start off by talking a little bit about the Liberal and NDP agreement. It's the Supply and Confidence Agreement, which is, I understand, not quite a coalition, but
Right.
what does it mean exactly? And
So it's not a coalition in the sense that there are NDP members who are in the cabinet serving as ministers. But it is a formal agreement that requires the NDP members to vote for any confidence bill, which would defeat the government, and supply is a fancy word of saying budgeting and money bills. So these are such as the budget we just saw. So this is basically an agreement that is it's a de facto Liberal NDP government, because the opposition NDP members are now required to vote the government line. They can criticize them in Parliament, but it does ring a little hollow because at the end of the day, they can criticize the budget all they like, but they're going to vote for it. The same thing in committees. They're able to ask questions and be critical, but it does ring a little hollow because regardless of what the government does, they have an agreement to support the government. And so the minority situation we have is also a de facto majority government, in that the Trudeau government could govern now until 2025. I don't understand why the NDP agreed to this. I think they'd be in a stronger position to go bill by bill and demand certain changes to get what they would like on a bill by bill. They would argue, I think, that they have done that broadly, but the Liberals are very shrewd as well, and I think they will also govern in their best interest as well. So it's going to be fascinating to watch. It does mean that the next election is likely not going to happen until 2025, or I would probably say more like 2024, but we will see.
so 3 years, likely no election federally.
Yeah, two to 3 years. I mean, look, things change in this business all the time. If I'm going to be partisan here, if Liberals act like Liberals and overspend or do another ad scam, things can change very, very quickly. So there are no guarantees in this business, but there's certainly the advantages now with the Prime Minister who has time, because there's starting to be speculation that Justin Trudeau might not run again. In a normal minority, he'd have to make a decision in the next 6 months. Now he could wait 2 years with this agreement, which gives him what every Prime Minister wants, and that's time. So from the Liberals' perspective, I think this is a win. For the NDP, I don't get it.
And so in what way, when we're talking about something like the budget, because this came out, I know it was a news headline, and then we were talking budget very shortly after. How would this supply and confidence agreement have affected what we see in the budget? What would the NDP, let's say, have asked for that might not have been there?
Great example. The budget talked about pharmacare, which is what the NDP wanted, but there's no money in it. So this to me is the NDP has given up its leverage to say, well, we're going to vote for the budget if you put money for some of these initiatives. So whereas normally in a minority parliament, we would all be talking about what's going to happen, and there'd be a lot of backroom discussions between different parties to support the bill. Look, we saw this for years under the Conservatives when Stephen Harper was in, because for 6 years he had to operate in a minority parliament, and he was always trying to win support for big bills like that. With this supply and confidence agreement, we know the results. The budget will pass because the NDP is going to vote for it. As I said, I think the NDP has given up an awful lot, and I don't see the win for them long term, but I guess we'll see.
A lot of Canadians, be it federally or provincially, do like minority governments because they like to see the politicians figure out a path forward together. Where does this put Conservatives do you look at it as almost like working with the majority government?
It's become that way. So on one hand, from our vantage point, it delays the next election, which we're not happy about. We think it's better to hold the Liberals accountable for every decision they make. On the other hand, I think a lot of Liberals are concerned about this because it moves the Liberals further to the left, working with the NDP. I think there's a lot of Canadians that didn't vote. Canadians didn't vote in the last election for a majority government. Now Trudeau is assuming is governing as if he has one. I think it opens up opportunities for the opposition, for the Conservative opposition, because it's going to give us time. It's going to give us time to highlight this NDP Liberal government that nobody voted for, and as they continue to raise taxes on energy, as inflation goes up, housing prices go up, and they're committed to their policies that are driving a lot of this. I think it's going to have more Canadians questioning a Liberal coalition with the NDP that I don't think is going to deliver for Canadians.
Obviously, the first thing to make headlines after that was the budget. Yeah. What is the perspective from the opposition on the key things that you think are good and maybe some of the things that you can critique? Yeah,
so I was in the budget lockup this year, and this is my first time in being in a budget lockup since before going into elected office. And I found the budget was really trying to correct a lot of things that the government had not been focused on. They spent a lot of time talking about housing, but when you actually looked at their policies, I call it a wallpaper budget. It was designed to kind of hide the cracks, cover the cracks on the housing problems we have in this country where people can't afford homes anymore, the inflation policies, the military, which has been underfunded and now we're paying the price, and the list goes on. So my concern is this is a government that is not really strong on a lot of the economics when it comes to keeping prices down, taxes at a level that we can sustain, and focusing spending on priority areas. There's a lot of spending in this budget kind of across the board, but I don't see a lot of priorities in it. So I think one of the Liberal government's weaknesses is that when it comes to setting priorities, they've not been strong on that. Mm-hmm. When they do set a path on economic issues or environmental issues, it usually involves more regulations, more taxes. We've been saying for years, a carbon tax is a price on everything, and it's going to drive up prices across the board. And that is what's happened. Now, the war in Ukraine has obviously made those problems worse. But when you start out and you're making prices more expensive and making life more difficult for Canadians, it's going to have a price on families. Let me give you one example. Today in St. Andrews, a liter of gasoline costs $1.80. You drive to Calais, the gas is $1.30 in Canadian dollars a liter. That is a 50-cent a liter difference. That means that not only are families paying more in this country just to gas up their vehicles, which they need to get around, families in the United States are in a better position, and that is because of the policies largely of this government. That accounts for that. Yeah. We have oil in this country, we can produce it, yet because of government policies, we're making life more expensive. And if your energy prices are more expensive, it means everything is more expensive. So these are the kind of policies that I think under the NDP-Liberal coalition are going to get worse and make life more difficult. And as the economics begin to not work for Canadians, they're going to look for alternatives. And I think when it comes to economics on taxes, Canadians do trust us on these issues. So, so this agreement, it means we lose some of our influence in Parliament. But I think it means politically we're going to be better off in the next couple of years when it comes to Canadians making a choice. That's how I see it strategically, that it's a short-term loss for us, but I think long-term, I just think too many Canadians are looking at their paycheck, their family budgets, and saying, we need a change. Mm-hmm.
Gas is obviously a huge issue right now. Is there any talk in Ottawa of at least reducing taxes temporarily on...
None. And in fact, the Liberals and NDP are determined to continue raising the carbon tax every single year, and they're going to start raising it faster and more. The amount it's going to go up is going to increase. So far from saying let's cool things, and in fact the Liberal government is critical of places like Alberta and Ontario, which are lowering the provincial taxes. The view from the federal government is energy prices should be higher because that will force the transition to renewables, but it won't, because the technology still is not there to make that conversion to replace hydrocarbons, and as well, the power grid is not able to sustain all of the electric cars that they hope to put on the roads. So the government is going to have to spend billions to do that. So we're going to spend a lot of money we're going to have to spend a lot of money if in fact the electric cars do come on the roads the way they want them to. And between now and then, life is going to get more difficult for working families, particularly people on a fixed income, seniors. It's going to get tough out there. And you know, this is being driven by policy. It's being driven certainly by COVID and by the war in the Ukraine. But the government can't just say we had nothing to do with that, because they are the first pillar that sets the basic policies, and that's where I think they're failing a lot of Canadians.
There is, I mean, obviously with the war in Ukraine, this idea to just do away with any dependence on Russia. So are there talks about New Brunswick and pipelines? And I know that there's obviously this interest in going away from oil, but in the meantime, is there an urgency whatsoever to find a solution?
So I don't think we're at the point where we're going to see Energy East come back because of some of the politics. But the natural gas terminal in St. John, I wouldn't be surprised if you saw a lot more interest in that and converting it from an import to an export. Now that would cost a lot of money, but I think there's a lot of support for that. So I do think we're going to see some changes to take advantage of Canada's resources in order to support our friends and our allies in Europe to get up, so they can get off Russian oil and natural gas. There's talk now of opening up the port in Churchill to in northern Manitoba as a way of getting getting oil out. But it's not just Canada. I mean, I'm loath to kind of get too deep into American politics, but I was astounded when I saw U.S. President Biden, the administration, going to Venezuela, and the Saudis to try to get them to pump more oil, instead of coming to Canada and saying, okay, we're going to relook at the Keystone XL pipeline from Alberta to Texas as a way of getting more crude into the United States to meet their needs, and then to ship it around to Europe as well. But I think there's no doubt the war in Ukraine has reset a lot of these agendas, and we're seeing this on supply chains, but we're also seeing it on energy independence. And energy now is not just about jobs and local economy, but it has national security implications. Because every day that a Western country buys a barrel of oil from Russia, they are funding the Russian military, which is in Ukraine, killing people. And so that is the choice we have. We can either continue that or take advantage of Canada's natural resources to starve Putin and his war machine.
And I know we talked about this a lot last time, but with a month just gone by, so much more has happened. What's your perspective on how Canada is dealing with what we're doing to Ukraine and what we're doing in terms of sanctions against Russia?
So I think the sanctions continue to go in the right direction, but my view from the start has been sanctions don't win wars. And the Russians will be very resilient. They will, they are resilient people, and no one should be under the illusion that sanctions are going to bring them to their knees. It will make life difficult in Russia and for many Russians, but given the government they have there, I don't think Putin and his cronies will care. I think more needs to be done to help the Ukraine military. We need to get more weapons to them. They have proven to be brave fighters, and they have taken the fight to the Russians. And the battle is starting to change, moving into the east. It's going to benefit because it's open terrain. And they're closer to the Russia. They'll be in a better position, I think, to fight, because they'll be on open terrain, which is more advantageous when you have that kind of heavy military. So we need to do more to get anti-tank, anti-aircraft weapons to Ukraine, and that's where I think both the Biden administration and the Trudeau government have not kept up with the demands, and I hope they reconsider that.
I know your wife Kelly was in Latvia recently, so I'm sure she has an interesting perspective from there as well. Where do you see this going? It's still mind-boggling that this is where we've come after COVID to where we're at now in the world.
Well, particularly when you see cities that are in ruin in a European country. These are shocking images that I think have shaken us to the core, because we thought this kind of warfare was a thing of the past, but in fact it's on the door of Europe. I don't know where it ends, because on one hand the thinking was the Russians would roll in and just take over Ukraine, but that's not happened. So I don't know. I think that's why I do think we need to be there to support the Ukrainians, so they will decide how this ends. Like, I don't advocate either that we should fight this war to the last Ukrainian. This is a question for Ukrainian citizens, but as long as they want support from the West, we should be stepping up to deliver it, and we should not be worried about our relations with Russia. I'd like to see Russia out of the G20. I think Russia should become a pariah state. I think we should cut them off. But again, it is a big country as well. They do have a lot of resources, and right now they do have a lot of wealth coming in from their natural resources, gas and oil in particular.
And obviously, back at home here, this war has had an impact on Canadians' lives in terms of gas prices, inflation, and this is coming out of COVID. What do you think are some of the biggest challenges, not just for the government to deal with, but for Canadians right now?
I think it's cost of living. I think it's cost of living. I've always believed that coming out of COVID, there's going to be a lot of economic damage. So while some have done well, and there was broad support for many, I think it's easy to underestimate the number of businesses that were impacted, savings that were spent down, and sometimes, in many cases, pension savings as well. And so for many Canadians are in a much more vulnerable position than they were 2 years ago, and now we're going into an environment of high inflation, of rising taxes, and even some job insecurity as supply lines change. So I think we're in a difficult economic environment. I know the top numbers look good. The stock market continues to do well. Governments are in a strong position, but I think it's easy to underestimate the devastating impact that inflation can have, not only on the cost of living, but the cost of borrowing, and we see that both on the housing market, which is being driven by interest rate increases, but interest rate increases are also happening because of inflation, and the government's central banks are trying to bring down inflation, but that is very difficult to do without also triggering an economic slowdown. So this is a tough environment for governments to be in. And I think it's a question of getting back to basics. We have to ensure we spend on priority areas. We don't just spend recklessly across the board. We try to keep taxes moderate at a reasonable level on Canadians. And we also have to recognize that central bank policies do have an impact on home prices. And of course, we're seeing that across the country, where in the last 6.5 years, the price of a home in Canada has doubled. It's gone from 430,000 to 860,000, and while fortunately prices are cheaper in our neck of the woods, they are still going up in Fredericton and St. John, and squeezing out young families that would like to get into the home market.
And Canada, I know that obviously the housing crisis is a worldwide issue, but for countries that we consider ourselves similar to, our housing crisis seems to be even worse.
It is, and we should compare ourselves to the United States, which is a large country with a lot of land, but their construction and their price of building a home is much less than what it is in this country. So we need to bring down the cost of homes that is often driven by regulations and municipal bylaws. And I know, for example, this is something we hear locally, that the councils in St. Andrews, for example, where we're speaking from right now, St. Stephen, they're all looking for what they can do to make it more affordable for developers and investors to come in and build homes. We're seeing some success. I mean, Greg Hooper has completed his building in St. George. They're having their grand opening this week, an open house for people to look at it. There's other properties that are being proposed and developed elsewhere. So these do require municipalities to be involved. But part of it, particularly in the larger cities outside of New Brunswick, the rising prices have been driven by local regulations, and those have to be removed because, again, I think I want to look at the U.S. here and their housing market. They really have, in some ways, they haven't. I mean, rising prices are a problem everywhere, but they're bringing on more supply at a better price than what we're seeing in this country.
And we've banned for 2 years, correct me if I get this wrong, foreign ownership of residential property?
Well, so what the budget is proposing to limit, with some exceptions, foreign purchases for the next 2 years, as a way to lower demand. Now there are a lot of exemptions. For example, if someone's here as a student, so it's. But the problem is not one just of demand; it's supply. Okay. It's primarily supply, I think, and we do need to build more homes across the country. We know this from the experience even in our communities in Charlotte County and throughout New Brunswick, that supply is having impact as well.
Now, in terms of economic recovery, I know East Coast obviously relies on the tourism industry for a lot of different businesses. I've had a lot of questions lately about ArriveCan, and generally that's going into the United States as a border community, people wanting to go over. We've done some workshops with CBSA that I was telling you about here for Charlotte County residents. But there is some concern, particularly in the tourism industry, that the ArriveCan app might limit, and the borders are easier to cross now, but to have that extra step might limit the amount of tourists coming over, visiting from other countries.
Well, I think it will, because it's impacting the number of Canadians that are just crossing over into Maine on quick day trips. Because some people they don't feel they have the capabilities of to navigate ArriveCan, or they're worried just something's going to go wrong, and so it will have an impact as well. Now, I think the major impediment, which was the required PCR testing in advance of coming home, is gone, and getting rid of that has been an important step. But I think the federal government should get rid of the ArriveCan. There is nothing on that questionnaire that our border agents can't request from people when they come through at the border. And I would like to see New Brunswick and Canada open for tourism again this summer, because so many of these operators have had a difficult time under COVID. I think a lot of people are going to be traveling this year, and Maine is going to be open, and Canada should be open in New Brunswick. And the ArriveCan is an obstacle, and more importantly, I think it's an obstacle to just living the way our lives. Canadians should not have to register with their government before coming home, and being penalized if they don't do so, when we have professional border agents who are there to assess the risk, ask questions, and input any information that's required at the border.
We're almost out of time, but I do want to ask you about a very specific issue that I know Grand Manan, big tourism in the summer on the island, but they do have their only bank, Scotiabank, scheduled to close in August. I know you've spoken out recently in Parliament about the situation on Grand Manan. What changes or hopes you have for the island?
Well, my hope is Scotiabank will reconsider. Canadian banks in this country are protected. They're protected as Class 1 as from foreign competition. And the deal is simple. If you're going to be protected, you have an obligation to serve communities. And shutting down the bank in Grand Manan is not like shutting down a bank in one community where you drive up the road 15, 20 minutes and there's an alternative. There is no alternative on Grand Manan. The idea that people are going to cross for an hour and a half and then drive 20 minutes up the road to a community that is part of the county, but not on a natural route for Grand Manan residents, to me makes no sense, and it makes a mockery of Scotia trying to tell people that they've considered this and this is a good solution. It is not. Grand Manan is a prosperous fishing community. There is a lot of banking that takes place because of the buying and selling of lobster and other seafood. My hope is that the bank will reconsider and do the right thing. I think the view from the head office in Toronto is wrong, and they have an obligation to consider these communities. And if they don't, people like me will go to Ottawa and reconsider this special treatment. Because if Canadian companies don't want to look out for Canadian communities, then little Machias Savings Bank, the Bangor Savings Bank, maybe they'll come in and service our communities, because there is a lot of cross-border trade between Maine and New Brunswick. And if banks in Toronto don't want to do it, maybe we should look at banks in New England to help us out.
Well, I always appreciate you coming in for regular updates. Hopefully in a month's time we'll have some better news on the front of Grand Manan. Thank you so much for being here today, John. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Vicki.
My guest today has been John Williamson, MP for New Brunswick Southwest. I'm Vicki Hogarth. Thank you for watching Southwest Magazine.
Southwest Magazine is a news and public affairs production of CHCO Television.